Hello, it is great to have you with us. Our first guest tonight is an economist, a futurist, and prolific author. He has written over 21 books over the last few decades, including The Third Industrial Revolution and The Zero Marginal Cost Society. All his work tackling the intersection of humanity, technology, and the planet and where it's all going. His work is used by heads of state in the EU and the People's Republic of China as they work on transitioning their own economies to the future. This is his latest book, The Green New Deal: Why the Fossil Fuel Civilization Will Collapse by 2028 and the Bold Economic Plan to Save Life on Earth. I asked Jeremy Rifkin why he wrote the book now.
The reason I wrote The Green New Deal is we are facing a global climate emergency. I want to be really clear about what I'm saying to folks here. Our scientists now tell us we are in the sixth extinction of life on Earth. Doesn't even make the headlines. It's the most important story, the most dramatic moment in the history of our species. We've had 5 mass extinctions on this planet of life over 450 million years, way before humans were here. And each time there was a tipping point in the chemistry of the planet and massive die-out of life. And on the average, 10 million years to get new life forms back on Earth. We are in the middle of the 6th extinction event in real time. And our scientists are telling us, and I want every parent to hear this, they're telling us that we're likely to lose over half the species that inhabit this Earth in the next 8 decades. We'll never see them or hear them again. They've been here for millions of years. The last time we had an extinction event of this magnitude was 65 million years ago. So we are asleep. But what's interesting is the young people are awakening really quickly. The Gen Zs, the millennial generation, they have gone on strike. And what's happened, and 3 times in the last year, young people have walked out of their classrooms or they've walked out of their businesses and their offices in 130 countries. That's millions of young people calling for a climate emergency and a Green New Deal. And I want to be clear what this is about. There have been protests all through history. We're protesting species. We protest around religious ideas, political ideas, economic ideas. But this is different. This is the first planetary revolt of the human race. This is the first time a generation of human beings, the young people, are seeing themselves as a species, an endangered species, and seeing their fellow creatures as part of their evolutionary family, and perceiving the biosphere of this Earth as the indivisible community. They're eliminating the other. They're seeing themselves as part of a single planet. There is no protest movement like this in history. So this is a pivotal turning point. I hope we get there in time where we can now make the changes that are needed. But this is a good sign.
I'm going to come back to this because you and I are having a conversation before the start about, tipping points and whether we're talking about survival or we can get back to where we were. And I want to come back to that. The title of your book, though, is Why the Fossil Fuel Civilization Will Collapse by 2028.
That's a subtitle, yeah.
Sorry, it's the first Green New Deal, and then of course that.
Yeah.
Why 2028? What's the significance of that date first?
What's happening behind the scenes is we're seeing the greatest disruption in all of economic history of the industrial era. It has not yet made the public venue, if you will, in terms of conversation. This year, in 2019, the levelized cost of big-scale solar and wind has now just gone below the cost of natural gas. Way below nuclear, the cost is way below coal, and it's now going below natural gas. This is a huge disruption. And solar and wind are becoming cheaper and cheaper, the fixed cost. They're plunging on an exponential curve, just like computers. They used to cost millions of dollars. Now we have a $25 computer that gives you more computing power than sent the astronauts to the moon. The same is happening with solar and wind. And what we're beginning to see is a massive panic in the fossil fuel industry. Citigroup, the great bank, they saw this coming around 2015 and they said, we may be facing $100 trillion in stranded assets in the fossil fuel industry because solar and wind will get cheaper and cheaper. So what does this mean? It means all the exploration rights that the fossil fuel industry has bought, to go and extract fossil fuels, they'll never pay back. It means all the fossil fuels under the ground or under the ocean floor we'll never use because they're too expensive. We have solar and wind that's cheaper. All the pipelines that will be abandoned because we'll never amortize out the cost and get the return on the investment. All of the refineries that will no longer be used. All the backup power plants that we don't use because solar and wind now are cheaper and more abundant. This is the biggest disruption in history. It's a carbon bubble. And what we're seeing inside the industries is it's likely to burst with the collapse of the civilization of fossil fuels somewhere around 2028. And the reason we know this, and these are all projections from studies in the book from inside the industries, the banking community, financial community, insurance industry, the various sectors. The U.S. will reach 14% solar and wind electricity by 2023. The world will reach it by 2028. And that means a collapse of electric utilities based on fossil fuels. The same is happening in transport as well as we move to electric vehicles.
The one thing that from a business audience is listening is to understand what needs to be true for that to happen. So, you mentioned, of course, you've worked with the EU, you've worked with the highest leadership in China. What has to be true from an infrastructure standpoint to see that collapse in 2028?
Well, given the fact that we're facing a climate emergency, we are in an extinction event, the real question is what kind of new economic vision do we need? Can we move it quickly? And can we ensure that we get out of fossil fuels in less than 20 years? It's a razor-thin path. The UN Climate Panel said we've got 12 years, now it's 11 years left to completely transform civilization. So how do we do it? We need to step back and look at how the great economic paradigm shifts occur in history. If we know how they occur, we get a roadmap and a compass in Canada and around the world to completely transition this society. There have been at least 7 major economic paradigm shifts in history. They're really interesting because they all share the same common denominator. And that is, at a moment of time, 3 defining technology emerge across the civilization that change the way we manage, power, and move economic activity, social life, and governance. Here are those 3 technologies. First, new communication technologies to bring larger collectivities together to annihilate time and space so we can engage in communication in bigger societies. 2, new sources of energy to give us enough power so larger collectivities of human beings can come together in economic life and social life and governance. And 3, new modes of mobility and logistics to move large numbers of people within a society for economic life and governance. When communication revolutions converge with new energy regimes and new mobility and logistics, it changes the temporal spatial orientation, changes the business models, it changes governance, it changes habitats. These are what infrastructures do. And I'd add one more point. If this sounds kind of common sense, even though it's not in any textbook, this is what every cell in an organism has to do. Every cell in every living organism has to have a way to communicate. It has to have a source of energy to stay alive. And it has to have a source of motility and mobility for movement. And it has to have a semi-permeable membrane, its skin, to orchestrate its insides with the outside world. That's what infrastructures do. They are prostheses that extend the organism so large numbers of people can conduct life in a social way with large numbers. We are in the midst of a 3rd industrial revolution, a convergence of communication, energy, mobility, logistics, and a change in the infrastructure in the built environment. The communication revolution is here. It's been 29 years since the internet. 4.5 billion people connected. We're Skyping in global classrooms, and a couple billion people are on Facebook, the biggest fictional family in history. So there's a lot of that here. Now this digitized communication internet that we're all involved in is just now converging with a digitized renewable energy internet. Millions of people now, homeowners, local businesses, neighborhoods, are producing their own solar and wind electricity. And what they're not using, they're sharing back on an increasingly digitized renewable energy internet, a utility grid, using the same data and analytics to manage energy between millions of people that we use to manage knowledge, news, and entertainment on the communication internet. Now the 2 internets are converging with a 3rd internet, mobility and logistics internet, made up of electric and fuel cell vehicles powered by solar and wind from the energy internet. And the vehicles will be autonomous in the next few years, no drivers, managed by big data and analytics from the communication internet. These 3 internets, which are digital, communication, energy, mobility, and logistics, they change the way we manage society, and they're being put on top of a platform called the Internet of Things. We're putting sensors in our buildings for smart appliances, smart vehicles, smart roads, smart warehouses. We're actually connecting the world in a global brain and nervous system. The brain is GPS, and those satellites are controlling and monitoring all the sensors. So we're beginning to engage the human race in real time so we become one big family in all our diversity. That's the upside, a great potential and shift in entrepreneurialism. The downside is the dark net, which we have to be concerned with. How do you protect network neutrality here? How do you ensure governments don't hack this new smart world for political purposes and interfere in other governments? How do you ensure big internet companies don't monopolize the data and commodify our daily experience? How do you protect against privacy concerns and cyber terrorism? But assuming we can deal with all this, this infrastructure is here, and now the market is speaking and saying solar and wind are now cheaper than all the other fossil fuels and nuclear. Then the question's the money.
Yeah. And you talk about this as well too, and I've heard you talk about the fact that pension funds obviously have a lot of money and are quite interested in this space. I've also heard from people that I've worked with that there's not enough projects for them to invest in.
You're exactly right. That's what I deal with in the Green New Deal in the book. This is our experience in Europe and now in America. What's interesting here, first of all, Karl Marx would be flipping in his grave. The fact is, most people aren't aware of this, but the largest pool of capital in the world belongs to the workers of the world. It's 41 trillion. It's public and private pension funds. Part of our deferred savings at the job is invested on our behalf for our retirement. 41 trillion. What's happened is these public pension funds now are leading the charge, and they're quickly getting out of fossil fuels. Why? They saw what happened in the U.S. when the coal industry went bankrupt in the last 4 years, because natural gas was cheaper and then solar and wind was cheaper. So all those workers lost their pension funds. So the big cities, New York, London, all over the world, there's scores of cities, over 100, they're quickly getting their public employee pension funds out of fossil fuels. Now private pension funds and institutional investors and insurance, they're all exiting. $11 trillion have fled out of the fossil fuel complex in just 4 years. It's a mass exit. Here's the problem. You got it. They're sitting there saying, we have massive amounts of trillions of dollars. We're leaving the fossil fuel civilization. We would like to invest in a smart third industrial revolution, a Green New Deal. We don't have any large-scale projects. If you go to any mayor in the world, there's 9,000 mayors that are in the Covenant of Mayors on the Paris Climate Agreement, and you talk to those mayors, they're going to show you their 12 beautiful electric buses, their 15 LEED buildings that are passive solar, their little bicycle paths and scooter paths that you can app in on. They're all little pilots. So the irony of this is the fossil fuel civilization of the industrial era is collapsing in real time. The market is saying solar and wind's cheaper. The money is flooding out, especially pension funds, and they're saying to every region in Canada, please, each region, give us a roadmap, lay out a Green New Deal. We'll then issue green bonds with green banks, and we'll pour the money in. We'll get steady returns on infrastructure because you know you get the returns on the productivity, and we'll be able to weather this storm and deal with climate change.
I've only got 30 seconds, and I do apologize for this, but I think it's so important. You say in your book at the end that it's important to we need to embrace the age of resilience.
Yes.
Why?
I'll leave you with this. In the U.S., we put out the entire first industrial revolution in 30 years, between 1860 and 1890. Roughly the same in Canada. A transcontinental railroad, telegraph system across the country, land-grant universities, homesteading acts. We did the second industrial revolution in the 20th century in 25 years, between 1908 and 1932. At least in the urban areas, we electrified, we put in road systems, we got the automobiles out, we put the gasoline stations in, the telephones. The third industrial revolution can be in less, 20 years, one generation. But it has to mean that here in Canada, every region has to be responsible for deploying a long-term construction project to lay out this infrastructure, and then your federal government has to wake up and create the national codes, regulations, standards, incentives, and alignments to make this happen. The regions have to deploy it. This can be done. So I don't want anyone in Canada to say to me, it's too late. It can be done. I don't want anyone to say to the young people, it's an important priority. And there are other priorities. What other priority could there be when we're in an extinction event of life? And that's what the kids are saying. So, you know, Canada has an older cultural DNA, well before fossil fuels, and that is the love of nature. Everyone comes to Canada because there's a love of nature in Canada. That's why people are here. You got to bring back that old cultural DNA and move a Green New Deal and a third industrial revolution across all these provinces and territories. You got to do it quickly.